Good evening, and welcome to the IOP Speaker Series event, Guys, It's Global, Unpacking a Year of Tumultuous Elections Around the World. My name is Alyssa Manthe, and I'm a current third year in the college from Antioch, Illinois. I'm double majoring in global studies and religious studies, and I'm particularly interested in the relationship between religion and the rise of authoritarian regimes. At the IOP, I'm a member of the Student Advisory Board and co-outreach chair of W+, a civic engagement group for women and gender minorities interested in public service. As a second-generation Kenyan immigrant and someone studying international relations, I know all too well how elections are much more than a mere transition between administrations. Tonight, we are joined by an outstanding group of panelists. Dr. Dan Markey is a senior advisor on South Asia at the United States Institute of Peace and the author of influential works on U.S. foreign policy, including China's Western Horizon and No Exit from Pakistan. Paul Nantulya is the research associate and China specialist at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies and is an expert on Chinese foreign policy, China-Africa relations, and mediation in peace processes. He received his bachelor's in Nairobi and a master's in defense and strategic studies at Missouri State. Annika Silva-Leander is the head of North America and permanent observer to the United Nations for the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. Mrs. Silva-Leander, an expert on democracies, is a true global citizen who grew up in France, has Swedish-Chilean citizenship, and holds degrees from the University of Stockholm, Oxford University, the University of Sussex, and the London School of Economics. Mark Landler will serve as our moderator. Mark is a London bureau chief of the New York Times and a former White House reporter who has reported from 75 countries over his long career in the States and abroad. His current focus is Britain in the post-Brexit era, and he uses London as a base to explore the geopolitical reach of the US. Together, they will discuss the larger meaning of the year when over half the globe voted and what these elections presage for 2025. Some quick housekeeping before we begin. First, please make sure to turn off or silence your cell phones. Second, when it is time for the Q&A, someone will place a microphone in the audience, and as usual, we will give priority for the first questions to students. Finally, please make sure to check upcoming IOP events, including contested election, contested mayorship, a look at Brandon Johnson's first year as Chicago's mayor, which will take place at the IOP on November 15th at 12 p.m., and Brat Summer Unusually Warm Fall, Real Talk on Energy Policy, which will take place in the third floor theater of Ida Noise on November 19th at 5:30 p.m. Make sure to check out the IOP's website for more on future speaker series events and other opportunities at the Institute of Politics. Now please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Dan Markey, Paul Nantulya, Annika Silva-Leander, and Mark Landler.
Well, good evening and welcome to our panel. Tonight we're going to talk about the lessons that we should draw from 2024, this global year of elections. It goes without saying that the biggest, most impactful election of all occurred here a week ago in the United States. But as singular as any US presidential election seems, and this one in particular, it was in one way simply the culmination of a year of historic electoral contests. From Taiwan to Indonesia, India to Britain, and Mexico to South Africa, more than 1 billion people voted in more than 60 major federal, national, local elections. So what did we learn from this global spectacle of democracy? Does it help put Donald Trump's victory last week into a broader context? And what does it say about the state of democracy, not just in the US, but around the world? John Byrne Murdoch, a fabulous statistician at the Financial Times, had a striking chart last week that showed how 2024 is the first year since 1905 in which every governing party in every developed country in the world lost vote share. And that underlines a key point. This has been an abysmal time to be an incumbent, whether you're Vice President Kamala Harris or Rishi Sunak, the conservative former Prime Minister of the UK. This isn't necessarily a left versus right phenomenon either. It's more a change versus more of the same phenomenon. Anti-incumbent fervor raged across the world as voters were fed up with the price of groceries, gasoline, and the failure of governments to confront issues like immigration and border security. But it's not just that either. There is also a deep-seated suspicion on the part of voters with the political establishment, with elites, whether in the media or academia, with identity politics, and with what critics like to deride as woke ideology. So while the voters threw out the conservative bums in the UK, they also give 14% of the vote to Reform UK, a populist party run by a close ally of Donald Trump, Nigel Farage. Far-right parties are on the march across Europe, and they may be emboldened by Trump's victory in the US. We've assembled this terrific panel tonight to help us make sense of the broader trends behind all these elections, and I hope in the process help us understand a little better what happened last Tuesday here at home. So I thought, just to sort of set the stage, I'd start on a kind of a region by region basis and ask each of these panelists to reflect on their own areas of expertise to help us understand dynamics in some of the elections that happened elsewhere. And I'm going to start down at the far end with Dan. Dan's an expert on India. Narendra Modi, the prime minister, is an old pal of Trump's. In 2020, he held a huge rally for Trump in his home state of Gujarat. The banner said, "Namaste, Trump." Like Trump, Modi has used a potent mix of nationalism and populism to become a political phenomenon in India. And yet, in India's election this year, Modi's BJP party got a bit of a cuff on the ears. They actually lost their majority and are having to govern in a coalition with other parties. Modi's still in power, but he had his wings clipped a little. I'm wondering, Dan, what happened? And what does it tell us about the strengths and limitations of these populist nationalist leaders?
Sure, thanks, Mark. Well, you're right. Modi did get his wings clipped a bit. Instead of having sort of a whopping majority, single party majority, and remember in India, instead of having a two-party system, you have a multi-party system. Instead of having a presidency of a parliamentary system, a prime minister. And so Narendra Modi governs as prime minister because his party has, and with now in coalition, has a majority of the seats in the lower house in India. But before, for his first two elections, 2014, 2019, his own party had captured a majority in and of itself, which in India is unusual. And so the political feat that the BJP, his party, had accomplished for two cycles running was really remarkable. And what they had done in the lead up to this election was set themselves up with an expectation that not only would they capture another majority, but that they would do so in a stunning style, and that they would even get maybe as much as a 2/3 majority to the level of being able to amend the Indian Constitution. And so in response to the question of sort of what happened, a number of things happened. One of them, I think, is sort of the generalized story that Mark's already laid out, which is one of it's hard to be an incumbent, and it's really hard to be an incumbent at times of global economic turmoil. And then it's even harder in India when you're facing the growing pains of a developing economy that simply isn't providing enough jobs for the younger segment of the society. So something like 40+% youth unemployment, youth being the younger part of the working kind of parts of the economy that would work. So you're facing all of those pressures, the external pressures of global commodity prices and so on, and the inside India pressures of really getting your economy to work for all your people. And so up against that, it's a very difficult task. In addition to that, as people have tried to unpack the Indian story, I think they've found that it's actually a highly variable story that changes from locality to locality. So it's not as if there was just one story that explains why people were unsatisfied with Modi across the country. No, you have individual stories of contests, between these many different political parties. And when you look at the overall vote share, the BJP only went down a little over 1 percentage point in terms of national election outcome, and that translated, because of their their partners, their coalition partners, to a significant loss in terms of seats in the parliament. So a lot of different stories going on there, but it isn't just a simple story of kind of overreach by a majoritarian populist. It's not that might be the story we'd want to tell, but it's not nearly so simple as that.
Gotcha. Let me move along, and then we'll circle back and do follow-up questions. Annika, I wanted to ask you about Mexico. Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, strikes me as a fascinating case. She ran as the handpicked successor to the outgoing leader, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, AMLO, and yet she still managed to present herself as a change agent who had helped uproot the establishment when AMLO won 6 years earlier. That strikes me as interesting, because I think there's a slight echo of Trump here, a former president who managed to run as an insurgent figure. But I'm wondering what it tells us about voters that they're willing to go along with a political pitch like that. What was it about the circumstances in Mexico that made them open, even in an anti-incumbent year, to say, yes, we'll take the handpicked successor of the outgoing president?
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting question, and Mexico defies this trend that you talked about, which has been a defeat for most incumbent governments during this year, and Mexico was the opposite. It was the continuation, even though it's a different leader. Claudia Sheinbaum is the heir that has been trained by Manuel López Obrador to take over the leadership of the Morena party. And they won, she won, and the Morena party as well won with a landslide. She won 60% of the votes, and the Morena party, her party, and AMLO's party won super majorities in Congress. So it wasn't just a win, a small win, it was a major win, which enables the Morena party to effectively implement the reforms that they had set out to do, which is the judicial reform is one of the main reforms to in their words, democratize the judicial system by democratically electing the judges. So it's a very interesting case of defying this trend that we've seen about incumbency losses. Why did we see this massive victory? I think a lot has to do with the economy, as you're mentioning, and as we will also talk about in a lot of the elections this year, including the US, the economy was a salient issue. And Morena Party has implemented massive social programs throughout Mexico with the aim of reducing poverty, reducing inequalities. It has not managed to reduce inequalities over the past 6 years, but it has effectively managed to significantly managed to reduce levels of poverty through these social protection and social programs that have been significant for a large share of the population in Mexico. And I think that explains in large part the win of the Morena Party. I think she was able to balance and she was able to present herself as the continuation of the success of the AMLO administration, while at the same time presenting novelty. She's a woman, she's the first woman ever elected as president in Mexico, and in a very patriarchal society, so it's such a historical win for Mexico. She was also able to present herself as much more outward-looking, internationally minded than AMLO, much more adept and savvy at foreign policy. And she is also a scientist, and I think that meant a lot for younger voters who care about climate change and so on. And so she came with that academic credentials that were important. So it was an interesting mix of different factors. I see I have a few more minutes, and I should say, if we're giving a regional overview, there were a number of other elections that happened in Latin America this year. 5 in democracies and 1 in the autocracy Venezuela. And I think that for the region as a whole, Latin America defined the incumbency losses as well. That was the global trend. You saw another party and president that has been in power for a number of years retain, and actually not just retain their majority, but gain another super majority. It was Bukele in El Salvador, which did a number of reforms to the electoral system to sort of push up the numbers for his party, but he is popular in El Salvador. And in Dominican Republic, it's a case that we don't talk a lot about, but it's also a case where you saw the governing party maintain themselves in power. So I'll talk about Venezuela later on, but that's a separate case.
Perfect. Thanks, Annika. Paul, in South Africa, the ruling African National Congress saw its vote share drop from 58% in the last election to 40% in the election held this year. And, you know, at one level, the reasons for this are clear. South Africa has a 42% unemployment rate and a crime rate that's 6 times that of the US. Still, the ANC has racked up majorities for years, even as South Africa's infrastructure and society has frayed. So I'm wondering, what was it about this year that finally made the voters rebel?
Right. I mean, those are excellent questions. But we have to go back into the context of South African history. The disappointing result of the African National Congress has been it's been evolving, right? If you look at the last 4 to 5 cycles of general elections in South Africa, the vote share of the ANC has been dropping steadily, right? From a high of about 68, 70% down to, it was actually 39%. It wasn't even 40% in the recent election. And so what one has seen over the years is a bubbling up of frustration within the ANC's primary voting community, which is predominantly black, predominantly poor, marginalized and excluded from the political process, right? But a constituency that still holds very firm to the anti-colonial, anti-apartheid ethos and liberation movement history of the African National Congress. This is one of the oldest parties in the global South. The African National Congress was formed before the before the Bolshevik Revolution. So it's it's older than the Chinese Communist Party and so on. So there's that deep history of the ANC. But nevertheless, the vote share has been dropping. There's a lot of frustration, as I mentioned earlier. But what is very interesting about this decline in the ANC's vote share, and which goes back to what you were talking about, which is the difficulty of incumbency, is that the losses, the percentage losses of the ANC are almost neatly equal to the parties that have been formed by breakaways of the ANC. So it happened with the United Democratic Movement. That was about 5%, right? That's the first time it happened. Then you had the Congress of the People under President Thabo Mbeki. I was still in South Africa at that time. It was a very, very interesting period in South Africa's history. And that share dropped by about 12%. Then the next big break came with the departure of Julius Malema, who was the president of the ANC Youth League, which broke away from the ANC and formed the Economic Freedom Fighters. That was a massive drop of about 27%. So this current drop, again, you had a splinter organization within the ANC, led by the former president, a populist, Jacob Zuma, who has been in and out of court on a number of corruption cases and so on. So he forms a party using the name of the armed wing of the ANC, Umkhonto we Sizwe, or Spear of the Nation, which appeals to those elements of the former liberation forces that were not integrated into the South African military. They feel marginalized, they're wallowing in poverty, there was this youth unemployment and so on. So it has now become the second largest party in South Africa. But if you look at the combined vote of the Economic Freedom Fighters, the Pan-Africanist Congress, which was a breakaway as well, and Umkhonto we Sizwe, together with the ANC, if you combine that vote, you get about 60%. So one can make the argument that while there was an agitation for change in South Africa, those that are frustrated with the ANC, which is the majority voting bloc of the ANC, still hold to the ideas of the ANC. So while the ANC has lost its majority, fundamentally, the tradition of the ANC remains resilient in South Africa. And one cannot even, so for instance, you look at the Democratic Alliance, which is predominantly white, predominantly, very conservative economically, and so on. It hasn't grown its share of the vote beyond 20%. So it has always maintained, 18, 19, 20%. The real knock on the ANC has been within the ANC itself. So that is a key difference between what we're seeing in South Africa and perhaps even other parts of Southern Africa that we can talk about.
Sure.
Because the ANC is not the only incumbent party that has faced this at the polls, right? We've had two very interesting elections over the past couple of weeks where ruling parties, liberation movements, were swept out of office, right? So you do have this
Which
trend.
countries are we talking about?
So we're talking about Mauritius, which was a couple days ago,
right.
which is in Southern Africa. And then you're also talking about Botswana, right? Where a ruling party that has been in charge since independence failed to get even 20% of the vote, right? And we can talk about elections in other parts of the continent. We're starting to see this push against incumbency, against old liberation movement parties by this young and emerging electorate, but which still holds very firmly to those liberation ethos. So Africa is in a very, very interesting dynamic at the moment.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny, there's a slight echo here of what I covered this past summer in the UK, where on the face of it, it looked like the Labour Party swept out the Conservative Party, and they did. And in parliamentary terms, it was a landslide. But once you began digging into the numbers, you realized a couple of things. One is that the share of vote that the Labour Party got was not all that great. In fact, it was smaller than the share of vote they had gotten when they unsuccessfully tried to unseat the government a few years earlier. And the primary reason that the Conservatives lost was they bled votes to this new Reform Party, which took 14% of the vote share away from them. And so if you combine the Reform vote share with the Conservative vote share, it's not as though Britain has suddenly gone from being a center-right country to a center-left country. It's just that the composition of the parties has changed. And then in turn raises an issue I'd like to hear from each of you on, which is the nature of voters and voter loyalty and volatility among voters. Because one thing that was just profoundly true in the UK election was the degree to which voters are just extremely volatile. And today, if you took there have been polls done in the UK of the Conservative versus the Labour Party. They now poll dead even. If you held that same general election today, it's not clear which party would come out ahead. And we're only 3 months into this new government. So it seems clear, at least in the Western world, that voters are far less patient, far quicker to change their party loyalty, try something different, cast a protest vote. I'm wondering if that's true across the board. I know Africa is slightly different because of the tradition of the ANC that you laid out. But for example, Dan, in India or Annika, are voters simply less dependable, more fickle, and more volatile for whatever combination of reasons?
Well, on the India case, I would say you definitely saw some swings, but as I tried to point out before, the overall share of voters that kept with the BJP was very similar. So a lot of it was more tactical. One of the things that was kind of interesting about India in terms of mobilization of voters, getting them out to the polls, still is a matter in some cases of literally getting them to the polls, physically making sure that they have access and so on. But another thing, just in every democracy, India is no different, is energizing them and making sure that they want to vote. And for the BJP in particular, one of the advantages that they've had is their ties to Hindu nationalist civil society organizations, volunteer organizations that drum up the voters with most of the elections. And in this election, in certain parts of India, particularly in the state of Uttar Pradesh, they did not do that, or reportedly they were less enthusiastic. So when you talk about sort of getting the voters there, part of it was the volunteers were less enthusiastic for reasons that are pretty idiosyncratic. I mean, they didn't have to do with some big story. They had to do with particular choices of candidates to run. So I'm a bit leery about sort of overdrawing the lessons or drawing too many similarities. I think one last thing, though, would be, this is Modi's third time running as prime minister. And so one of the challenges in terms of exciting an electorate is, what do you do the third time around? It gets harder every time. Even when you've been successful, now the things that you used to be able to promise, some of them you've already delivered. And so that in itself can be a problem. So it's not just failure, even success can be a political problem if you're in power long enough.
Annika, maybe address the volatility question, and don't limit yourself to Latin America by any means. If you have broader thoughts, I guess the question is the volatility I saw UK specific, Western specific, or are there elements of that extend more broadly?
I think you can see it in a lot of countries. People are not loyal to a traditional party the way they used to be in the past. And you see that in a lot of regions. And you see that by a lot of new parties being created. In Latin America, you also see candidates that are running without a party. I mean, Bukele has his party New Idea, but he operated, the party wasn't central to his election initially. So I think the delivery of the parties and the failure of delivery of traditional parties, I think, is what has pushed voters away from them to new alternatives. Whether it be new parties or new shifts within existing parties. For example, the Republican Party in the United States is the same party, but it has shifted ideologically. So I think what voters want to see is parties that deliver for them in everyday life, for their economic and social well-being. And so they will vote for the party that does that.
Right. I wanted to sort of shift the conversation slightly and ask a bit, and this is more, it departs from Donald Trump and his election. But what I'm wondering is whether we can talk a little bit about the sort of geopolitical implications of a Trump victory. And I sort of am interested in it on two levels. One is, does the victory of Trump embolden populist far-right parties worldwide, just by definition? Or are countries different enough that what happens here doesn't automatically translate to other places? And then secondly, for countries that are not, even nominally democratic, like Russia and China, does it really just super empower the strongmen leaders in those countries? And if so, in what ways? And so, for example, Paul, I'd like to hear you a little bit on China and Xi Jinping and Taiwan. But Dan, maybe also a little bit on what you think it means for the likes of Narendra Modi. Is this just unqualified good news for him? Or is India sui generis enough that his future depends on what happens in India without much regard to what happens here in the US? Maybe you want to start, Paul, with China?
Yeah, I think, China is a country I watch carefully, and I've been watching it carefully for the last 20 or so years. I think, the Chinese are creatures of habit, and they are creatures of history and historical precedent. And I think what you're going to see in China is the bureaucrats that were there during the first Trump administration, who experienced the first Trump administration, are probably going to have a lot of influence over the evolution of Chinese foreign policy over the next 4 years. They're going to swing back into the administration, into the structures of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So that's one. Two, I think the Chinese are preparing for, just to use the Mandarin phrase, they're essentially preparing for combat with the United States, because they expect, what we saw between 2016 and 2019, 2020, which was the tariffs, the retaliatory actions and that were there and so on. I think if one looks at the Chinese state-owned and state-owned press, there's a very sort of like pessimistic tone with regard to what might come next in the China-United States relationship. But their major economic equities, the China of today is not the China of Mao Zedong. China is a major player in the global economy. Some of the world's largest state-owned enterprises with major foreign acquisitions, major investments in port developments in Africa and other parts of the global south are Chinese. Today, the Chinese are running the world's largest shipping fleets and the world's largest managers of port developments in Africa, in Latin America, in South Asia, and so on. I think the Chinese are going to double down on that. It's true that China is facing economic headwinds at home, but China has been there before, and the Chinese have a way of linking economic depression in China with expanded overseas investments, because they control what their state-owned enterprises do. Very few countries are able to control money in that kind of way. So I think you're going to see a new phase of essentially very aggressive Chinese consolidation. We saw this. I was in Beijing in September on the heels of the China-Africa Summit, the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation. 147 deals worth $4 billion were concluded, right, in a space of what, 8-9 days in China. And so you're going to see that. You're going to see China really doubling down on its engagements in the global south. In terms of the impact or lack thereof of what we just saw in this election, I think on the African continent there are three schools of thought. There's the one school of thought that says that going back to 2016, the issues of democracy, issues of governance, issues of human rights were perceived to have been de-emphasized by the United States. And so if one looks at social media and looks at what pro-democracy organizations in Africa are saying, they're downcast by this result.
Yeah.
So that's the one school of thought. Then on the opposite end of the political spectrum, you have the other school of thought, articulated by regime propagandists that look at it as a welcome development because America first is seen as America, get off our back and stop lecturing us. And we can consolidate power and engage in repressive and oppressive activity without deterrence from the United States. So that's the second school of thought. Then you have a third school of thought that's basically saying, ultimately, the responsibility and the engine and the center of gravity for Africa's transformation, it's important to remember that this is a continent where 78% of the population is between the ages of 15 and 29, right? Lots of energy, lots of dynamism. That energy ultimately must come from Africans and from Africa's democratic movements, with or without a democratic or a Republican administration in place. Mm-hmm. So these are the three schools of thought that are currently basically playing out on social media and in the policy discussions and policy discourse and the media discussions on the African continent with regard to our election here. Yeah.
Are there three schools of thought in India?
I don't know if there are three. There are many, many schools of thought in India. There are many of everything in India.
Yes.
Let's put it that way. I was going to pick up on some of those points, though. Look, I think generally speaking, this current Indian government is comfortable with, and in some ways, marginally to more than that, happy about Trump's victory. As they look at the United States under Trump, they anticipate something useful for them on the China front. For India, a more hawkish United States on China, even more than the Biden administration has been, creates some opportunities for India. They anticipate puts more emphasis on direct US-China competition. As most of you probably know, India and China have had some troubles over the past 5 years, particularly along their border. I think India anticipates that the more the United States pushes on China, the less India will have to fear from China directly. So that may or may not be true, but I think that's part of the anticipation. They're cautiously optimistic that a Trump administration would take a significantly different approach to the Russia-Ukraine war. And this is important for India because India continues to be one of the very few countries that tries to have a very good relationship with the West and also a very good relationship with Moscow. And so this war has put India in a very difficult and awkward spot. And they believe that Trump coming to power, if the United States will somehow resolve this war, that will redound to India's benefit. And then thirdly, this is not an Indian government that has been moving to a more liberal or more democratic direction over the past now decade plus. This is a place which has increasingly, by its critics at least, been seen as slipping toward autocracy and illiberal rule, with more and more controls of the media, less and less space for academic and think tank and other types of research. And for an India like this, a Trump coming into office, a Trump that they can anticipate will have no particular concerns about that, will not raise a voice of alarm about that, will not castigate or criticize India for the way that it treats its media, might even enthusiastically endorse certain types of a clampdown on the Indian media. That's something that the Modi government will also greet with open arms. So, and to your broader question about, does this kind of speed the path forward of autocracies globally, I would say it's not a breeze that does well for any Democrats to champion them. They are losing a voice, a powerful voice, but not an all-powerful voice from Washington. And this will put them in the shadows in a way that I think will make many of them suffer and will be uncomfortable for those champions. And I think that's to some extent true in India, but elsewhere as well.
Well, Annika, maybe you could tackle, again, both of those questions. One, to what extent is a victory by Trump transferable? Does it fuel or speed, other such movements around the world? And then also just sort of is it a license for people in places like Venezuela to carry on doing what they're doing in a way that would have been harder otherwise, or not? I mean, I remember that the Trump administration had plenty of problems with the Venezuelan government too. So what would be your thought?
Maybe on the first part of the question, I think the move towards right-wing populism in all over the world has been a trend that we have seen for a number of years already, and it's not necessarily linked to what's happened in the US. For sure, there is a mimicking effect as well, and the US has an important role to play on the global stage, and it has traditionally been a model and a beacon of democracy for the world. So what happens here matters. But there are, of course, also domestic developments that determine the movement of populism and political parties in a given country. I think it remains to be seen how this Trump administration, what its policies will be when it comes to foreign policy, but also domestic policy. And I think that some of the nominations we saw today show that this government is not going to be an isolationist government. It's going to be the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor. Those are people that are well versed in foreign policy and that are champions of democracy and human rights globally. Marco Rubio has been a strong advocate against Venezuela. So there are some autocrats that will be, and including China as well, that will be worried about what happens in a second Trump administration, because we might see a stronger, a firmer hand in relation to those, including Venezuela. So we'll wait and see what happens and what the policies of this new administration will be. Yeah, I'll stop there.
I guess what I'd like to do now is sort of step back and address the biggest question, which is what this incredible, as you called it, Annika, this super cycle of elections says about the state of democracy writ large. Obviously for several years, people have been anxious about what they see as backsliding, the rise of illiberal democracies in places like Hungary and Poland, far-right parties on the march in Western Europe, and not to mention the rise of strongmen in places like Turkey and India and elsewhere. So, now we've had all of these elections, and I'm struck by a couple of things. With the few blatant exceptions like Venezuela, most of them have been carried out in a fairly free and fair way. I leave out Russia, of course, where there's absolutely nothing free about that, and Putin was elected with 88% of the vote. But if you even look at the United States, an outcome that I imagine most of the people in this room, many of the people in this room might have some issues with, it was nevertheless a clean, well-run election. Unlike the last time, the vanquished candidate is not contesting the result. And you could argue that this was not actually a bad exercise in democracy, and maybe some of these other elections weren't either. So I guess, Annika, I'll go back to you for this to start, but I want to hear from both Paul and Dan. When you look at this year of elections in total, does it leave you feeling that democracy continues to be in sort of secular retreat, or are there actual glimmers of hope? Do you see kind of signs that this system of government remains resilient for all the knocks it's taken?
I'll build on the last point you made,
Yeah.
which is about optimism and hope. And I think that this super cycle year of election, ultimately the conclusion that I draw, that is, it shows that democracy is resilient, and that elections in most parts of the world function well. We looked at the 70+ elections that have been held this year. Around 34% have been held in countries with high levels of electoral integrity. I think the other thing we should mention, though, is that there are around 18% of the elections that were held this year that were held in autocracies, where they call it elections, but there is no democratic dimension to those rituals that are happening in those countries, including Russia, Iran, Venezuela. Well, Venezuela is a separate case because the opposition actually won there under very difficult circumstances. Rwanda is another example. Belarus, and several more autocracies that still want to hold the ritual of election to have some kind of veneer of democracy, even though they are there is no space for political competition or for a free media or for anyone else than the incumbent party to win. But taking those elections aside, I think overall there's been a lot of good, fair, free, credible elections that have taken place this year that show democracy is resilient. There is another category, however, I should mention, of countries where we're seeing increasing concerns, where you don't see rigging necessarily on election day, you don't see ballot stuffing on election day, but you've seen a gradual democratic backsliding leading up to the election, which creates an unlevel playing field for the opposition, where the media is controlled by the state. Georgia is one case in point a few weeks ago where that happened. El Salvador is another case in point where certainly Bukele and his New Ideas party is very popular among citizens, in part because he has proven very effective in combating crime and organized crime and violence. He's done it at a very high human rights cost, but he's also rigged the system to make it work for him. I mean, he implemented an electoral reform that would boost the numbers for his party. He changed the constitutional court so that they would allow him to run for a second term, even though the constitution didn't allow it. And he may now, with his supermajority, also change the constitution so that he can, so that there are no longer term limits, which happens a lot in Africa, unfortunately. And so those are the elections that we should be concerned about, where the electoral systems are distorted in favor of a certain political party, where the environment in which the election takes place is shrinking both the media space, the space for a free media, for critical voices, and for civil society. Those we should be watching out for, because those are the most treacherous ones, because the elections on the day of are still considered relatively competitive, but with many shortcomings, and it has a lot of.
And do you see that? I mean, it strikes me that in a couple of the countries where one could argue this trend has been underway for some time, they've still had cases where the governing parties had an unfavorable outcome. I suppose the most extreme example is the opposition actually winning in Venezuela. So I guess the question I have is that a growth industry still in the world? Countries where the media and other institutions are being co-opted in such a way that the election ends up being a veneer? Or have we kind of reached the peak of that trend?
I don't think we've reached the peak of that trend, unfortunately. And I think that what is key in those situations, which is not happening in Venezuela, is that as long as the judiciary remains somewhat independent, there is still opportunity to contest. In Venezuela, the executive and Maduro controls all branches of government and the military entirely, and so there is very little hope for any democratic opening in those contexts. Right. But in situations, and you'll speak to that better, but in Senegal, for example, where there were, and in Guatemala is a case in the region that I'm talking about, where there were clear attempts to obstruct the electoral process and to obstruct the opposition candidate, the judiciary came in and played a key role in allowing them to compete and to win ultimately. So key, as long as the judiciary remains somewhat independent, I think there is still hope. Poland is another case where the judiciary was co-opted,
right.
and controlled, and the PiS party still lost.
Right.
So even in those contexts, it is possible, but it becomes much more challenging.
Paul, do you want to pick up and talk a bit about?
Yes, certainly that captures the picture in Africa, where you have incumbents that put the judiciary, the legislative branch, and the civil service in their pocket, co-opt them, and then just orchestrate and routinize fake elections. These are essentially sham elections, making a mockery of the electoral process. A fair amount of that takes place on the African continent. It can lead, and I understand, those who say that this is basically a sign that democracy is not working. Certainly that's the narrative that, Chinese, the Russians, they put out that narrative that, democracy is messy. You can run an effective, tightly controlled state, deliver services without having to engage in an electoral enterprise. That is music to the ears of a lot of these autocrats that Africa has a fair share of. But at the same time, if we look at what's happening on the continent in terms of the demographic reality that we're facing on the continent, there's a very important organization called Afrobarometer, which has been polling African attitudes towards democracy, towards governance, towards corruption, towards the major powers since 1999. And those surveys have shown consistently that the African demand for democracy is solid. It's robust. It's always in the region of above 70%. In the recent poll, it was very interesting because they looked at attitudes towards foreign powers. And one of the things that they were trying to do was to try and see if support for China in Africa, which is strong, translates into a dampening of the demand for democracy, and they found the exact opposite. That in cohorts that welcome Chinese engagement on the African continent, 80% still believed that democracy is the best form of government, right? And even a higher percentage believed that one-party rule and military rule is completely unacceptable and inapplicable on the African continent. So, if I am sitting in the propaganda department of the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing, I would be extremely worried about my job, because it means that my messaging, China is a one-party state, right? All these things that we've mentioned in these Afrobarometer reports, it means African audiences are not buying that, right? So it means that China doesn't have much to sell when it comes to its governance model.
Interesting.
Neither does Russia. So yes, it's true that we do see in many of these demonstrations, people are waving Russian flags and stuff like that. But if you really look at the data, the demand for democracy is robust. That robustness is due in part to this young demographic that we're talking about. And that gives one hope, because it clearly shows that resilience for democracy in Africa remains extremely strong. Mm-hmm. Now, Senegal is a good news story. We look at Namibia. Namibia is about to go into an election, and all indications are that the ruling party is going to be pushed to below 50%. just like what happened in South Africa. So when one looks at those trends, and we can look at you can look at many other examples around the African continent, I think that robustness should be good news, that there's that robustness and there's that real demand, authentic, organic to Africa. It's not being imposed by America. It's not being imposed by the West. I think the message that is coming from these cohorts is that democracy is an African thing. It's not a foreign imposition into the African space. So from that perspective, I think I would be optimistic in the continent's future.
I wanted to, Dan, I'll throw this to you as well, but I wanted to very quickly, before we get to Q&A, raise a topic so I don't neglect it, and that is the role of social media. I mean, obviously in the United States, in this past election, the role of Elon Musk and his social media platform has been very much in the center of the debate. I wonder to what extent that has become as big an issue in elections elsewhere around the world. And I don't know, Dan, maybe you take a crack at that, but feel free to speak more broadly about the state of democracy too.
Yeah, so I'll try to do both. But in India, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his party, they've really been long-time pioneers, very active, very capable in the social media space. And have built a machinery to mobilize public sentiment by use of that. Huge groups of people actively disseminating messages, doing it in ways that try to use things like Twitter and so on, or X, to really push this out. So I'd say India and the BJP have been ahead of the game in this space. And have really pushed it to show how much more effective it can be than traditional media, even though they have basically put the screws to traditional media in India as well. So they've kind of an all of the above approach to management of media in India. It shows it's effective. It changes the national narrative. There are very few spaces for independent and even critical voices. And yet, in spite of all of that, during these last elections, you did see certain voices pop up almost seemingly out of nowhere. It seemed like genuine grassroots criticism of the government and of the BJP in particular that came onto the same kinds of platforms and sort of were trending in the Indian social media space. So it is a double-edged sword. It can cut both ways, but I'd say in India, it's largely pushed in the benefit of the government. Coming back to the broader points, India is interesting in other ways as well. We talked about resilience of democracy. I think that's true. But the problem in India isn't just it's not a matter of sham elections. These are real elections, and they weren't completely controlled, although the space for contestation, as I've tried to explain, was limited. In India, you have a different problem as well, which is majoritarianism. Right, so we often talk about the state of democracy, but we sometimes neglect the state of the protection of minorities as being an essential feature of a healthy modern democracy. And that's something that India really struggles with, because you can win national elections again and again and again and do it legitimately because you're appealing to the majority of Indians, and yet still do things and take policies that are very dangerous to minority groups in India and are actively opposed to them and limit the protections of them. And that has more to do with the quality of governance in between elections than it has to do with the elections themselves. We use democracy as a shorthand for all of those things too frequently, and it's not. And so I think that's something that we need to be watching very closely. Has implications for the way that India runs itself, again, between the elections, the kind of accountability that its leaders have to their own people, and the transparency or lack thereof by which they make decisions. And during the periods of this government's rule, you've seen a real deadening of national debate on issues of critical importance to India, to the Indian national interest, including India's relationship with China, which gets almost no mention in the Indian parliamentary debates. And you imagine having a democracy that is, in a sense, so unaccountable publicly to its people that it never feels the need to defend major defense and national security policies in front of them to an audience that can speak back. So that's the gap, right? So it's a lot of different things going on here, and yet you can still have an election where the ruling government loses a lot of seats.
Right. Well, what I'd like to do now, we have about 15 minutes left, is open it up for questions from all of you. And I understand the custom here is that the first 3 questions go to students. And I hope what I could also ask is that you identify yourself by name and just tell us who you are so we know who's asking the question and to whom you want to address the question. And I'll do my best to look through the glare of the lights and see who wants to ask first. And there are microphones set up, I notice now, so you should come and use the microphones in each of the aisles. So perhaps we could start with that? Okay.
Hi, my name is Divya Mehrotra. I am a 4th year in the college studying political science and business economics. I'm actually writing my thesis on the recent coups that have happened in West Africa since post-2020, but I'm not going to ask about that. I actually did want to ask, post this election in the United States, there's been a lot of conversation about what 26 and 28 are going to look like for the Democrats. On a global scale, what would it take to push to reintroduce an element of change, but for the parties that have just lost, in regimes that were previously incumbents but are now on the opposition side of things? What would it take for them to reassert themselves in positions of power?
Annika, you want to take a crack at that?
Well, it depends on the country and the context and the interests and grievances of the voters and the reasons why they voted for another party than the incumbent. But I think that what runs through a lot of these cases, both in Europe and in the US and possibly in other countries, but in Europe and the US, I think that there is concern among voters about the economy. And that was very clear here in the United States. And so to address those concerns, which have to do here with rising prices, housing affordability, rising inequalities overall, and cost of living generally, I think in Europe, and you saw it here also in the US, a concern about immigration. That is something that also has pushed many European countries towards parties that promote much more restrictions on immigration coming into Europe. So I would say that those would be some of the concerns. I think what we've also seen here and in countries in Europe is backlash against identity politics. And I think that is something that you see when progress is made for minority groups, though that progress for minority groups of different kinds creates resistance, and especially in a context of economic vulnerability, that resistance can be even stronger. I would say if we look at Latin America, you add on top of those grievances concerns about corruption. That is something that has driven voters as well. Concerns about corruption and about citizen security. So fixing those, addressing those issues that are of concern to voters would be key.
All right, this gentleman over here.
Hi, my name's Kenneth Newman. I'm a local resident and alum, and I work in soccer, and I've traveled to 20 countries. So I've seen, including Eastern Europe in the East Bloc days. So I've seen my share of different types of government. My question, though, is more about Asia. And while most Americans are focusing on Ukraine, Russia, I consider China's expansion to be a more short-term potential war And now China just took land from Bhutan, which is causing India to most likely put troops in the Himalayas. So my question to you is, do you feel that China is trying to be too aggressive and too expansion-oriented, and they will set themselves thin and then have multiple fronts in wars, I guess I would say?
Maybe Paul?
Yeah, that's
I did also ask you about the invasion of Taiwan.
Right.
I remember, and you didn't answer that. So
Yes. Yeah. No. Taiwan. African countries have a very interesting relationship with both mainland China and Taiwan. Right now, there's only one African country that still recognizes Taipei over the PRC. That wasn't the case even 20 years ago. Even 10 years ago, that wasn't the case. But nevertheless, the Taiwanese do maintain unofficial relations in many countries, many countries on the continent. And African countries have kind of tried to hedge, between the PRC and Taipei, but they tend to be very critical. So, for instance, when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, the loudest criticism came from African countries, and that says something about the sorts of relationships that the PRC has on the continent. But moving over to China in the neighborhood, definitely there is a lot of concern among China's neighbors, both maritime and land neighbors. We've seen what's happening in the South China Sea with the 9-dash line. We've seen what's happening with the Philippines. Those territorial disputes and stuff like that. So when one looks at when one looks at the data, when one looks at the polling, one sees it very clearly that in that part of Asia, especially Southeast Asia, positive attitudes towards China are extremely low, and that is directly related to the territorial issues that the Chinese military appears to have used force, and it's not just the Chinese military, but then also the Coast Guard. But it's not just on the military side. There's economic coercion as well. China has used its economic muscle to kind of, strangle, its neighbors. We've seen this in the Philippines and so forth. I expect that to continue. I think there's a very powerful force that permeates the Chinese political system, and that force is nationalism. And so that nationalism, which is essentially the engine that Xi Jinping and his predecessors have used and have mobilized, in order to strengthen their sense of power and to strengthen their sense of legitimacy. And if you're running on nationalism and you have these big ambitions, to return China to a status of a great power, sitting against this nationalism in a context of a country where you don't have democratic elections, then you're going to see more of that. And I don't see, yes, there'll be, diplomatic initiatives and all that, but I see that as something that has become intrinsic to Chinese foreign policy, especially in that part of the world.
Thank you.
Dan?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly pick up on this because there's a coda to the story that the questioner asked, particularly about the India-China relationship, which has been tense and conflict prone and has led both countries to put tens of thousands of forces up along the Himalayan border. But in recent weeks, including at the BRICS summit just a couple of weeks ago, you did see an effort on both the Chinese side and the Indian side to calm that and to actually address some of those outstanding territorial concerns and to begin a process of pulling troops back. Now, to your point, Paul, I don't see this as a fundamental shift in India's view of China or their sense that China is an aggressive, dangerous regional neighbor, but it is a tactical shift which may reflect a sense on both sides, and would be interesting if it's a broader Chinese sense, that there are benefits from relenting a bit, from playing a longer game, from stepping back from some of these regional hotspots, and focusing on things that they care even more about. And that, I would say, would be Taiwan. So there may be something broader, a bigger story going on here.
Okay, we have a little over 4 minutes left, and I want to get 2 more questions. So, question to you, please keep it brief.
Yeah, my name is Maria. I'm an MPP student, and I just wanted to ask your thoughts on, it was briefly mentioned how India is looking at the new administration of the United States in relation of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and I wanted to ask what's the take in Europe, particularly with what's going to happen in Germany with the new no confidence vote and like everything that's happening with Scholz. If there are any thoughts on what's the Europe's perception of the incoming administration of the US in relationship to Russia and Ukraine?
Well, I suppose I could answer that, since that's sort of what I cover. I mean, Europe faces a very big challenge because, they really relied a lot on the United States to build this unified coalition. And so the individual countries might remain quite committed, but lacking the engine of the United States, I think it's going to be hard to maintain that solidarity. And we don't yet know the outcome of this election next February in Germany, which could produce, of course, a government with a kind of a different point of view. And remember what the Germans did in that Zeitenwende when they threw their support behind Ukraine was a really landmark change in their foreign policy. So it will be interesting to see whether they maintain that. As for France and the UK, the new UK government is every bit as committed to Ukraine as the last one was, but it's going to have a difficult relationship, I think, with the Trump administration. And Macron is a lame duck dealing with a great deal of domestic problems because of an election he called this past year that didn't go the way he wanted. So I think it's a difficult situation that they're facing, and whether they can keep this unity will actually perhaps be one of the greatest tests of the European project that we've seen in quite some time. So, sir, I'll give you the last question.
Sure. So Hillary Clinton was 2-1 or 5-1 favorite, and she lost election. This election we considered very close, and they were not. What's the reason that all polls always wrong?
Okay, that's a good question. Which of you wants to take a crack at it? Annika or Dan? Go ahead. I'm fascinated by this question as well, and I wouldn't claim to be a methodologist on polling, but it really does strike me that the challenges facing the pollsters now are increasingly, they've set the expectations very high. We practically govern by polls. I think it's very dangerous, and I think it's kind of, it actually hurts us more than anything. But we all seem to believe that the pollsters have this kind of magic bead on the truth out there, when in reality we have been repeatedly shown that they do not. And this is not just a US problem. In India, the pre-election polls suggested that Modi would romp and that he would sweep through to not just another majority, but a huge majority, and quite, to the contrary. So polling is a problem everywhere. It's gotten more complicated in part because some of the differences are very narrow. So in India, as I said, the change between the last election and this election was just over a percentage point, and that changed the entire outcome of the shape of the parliament. So a miss can be huge in terms of its actual consequences, in terms of the way these electoral systems work. And then I guess the other thing would be people don't respond to pollsters the way that they used to. I think to the extent that I've read the literature, it's very difficult to get answers from the kinds of people that you need to answer the questions if you're a pollster. And that's true, again, in the States as well as elsewhere. And it's not likely, as far as I can tell, to get any better. So in a way, it'd be a lot healthier
if we did a lot less governing and decision-making on the basis of what we think are the polls, and a lot more thinking and describing the pros and cons of policies, not on whether they're popular, but whether they actually work. I think that'd be a smart move for all of us going forward, but I don't anticipate it happening.
Well, on that uplifting note, I want to thank Dan, Annika, and Paul for a terrific conversation. And I want to thank all of you for coming and for your really good questions, and have a great evening.